For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on Talking Point this week, we're looking at India, China, and Pakistan's nuclear deterrence policies with Dr. Ashley J. Tellis. A warm welcome to Dr. Tellis. Good morning, Dr. Tellis. Appreciate you giving us time.
Good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here with you back again. Thanks, Amitabh.
Dr. Tellis, your latest report, or should I call it a book? I mean, your first line there is that it took about 20 years in writing, in research, and talking to people in not only these three countries, but in the US, in Europe, etc. Could you tell our viewers the implications of China's dramatic nuclear expansion, which, of course, as you put it, is primarily aimed at achieving parity and overtaking the US in their view of things, but in comparison to what you see as India's slow nuclear modernization?
So thank you, Amitabh. You know, this is a subject that I have been intrigued by since I wrote my first book on India, soon after the 1998 nuclear tests. And I thought during the pandemic, I would take the opportunity to see where, the three countries, China, India, and Pakistan, have come over the journey of the last 20 years. And the storylines are sort of stark, dramatic, and in some ways also unexpected. US-China relations have degenerated towards much more intense competition than we had imagined in 1998. And so it's not surprising to me that the Chinese have also attempted to adapt their nuclear capabilities to deal with this competition. And it is a dramatic shift because throughout the Cold War, China maintained very small nuclear forces. Those forces were kept at very low levels of readiness. And the survivability of those forces was highly questionable. But because China was not involved in acute security competition with the United States at that point, and because the United States and the Soviet Union mutually deterred one another, China was content with a small and relatively weak nuclear force. Now the world has changed quite a bit. China sees itself as being locked into a major strategic competition with the world's most sophisticated nuclear power. And so what they have done is to shift along multiple dimensions in capability. So from a force that was probably less than 200 warheads during the Cold War, China is now expanding its nuclear force quite dramatically. And we don't know what the end size of that force is going to be. The Pentagon has publicly assessed that the Chinese stockpile today consists of about 350 warheads, so almost double that of the Cold War force. And they believe that that number in turn will double again within this decade. My calculations in the book suggest that China has enough fissile material for about 700 warheads. And if it wants to move beyond 700 warheads, which the Pentagon believes is the likely objective, then China will have to go back to producing fissile material once all over again. In contrast, India has, moved very slowly. And I think that judgment is shaped by the fact that India does not put as much stock in nuclear weapons as the Chinese do, because both the threats that India faces, Pakistan and China, are deemed to be relatively manageable threats with the capabilities that it currently has. Now, whether that will remain India's judgment over the long term, remains to be seen. But it was really striking to me as I completed the research that of all the three countries that I looked at, China, India, and Pakistan, India has been the most conservative in the way that it still thinks about nuclear weapons and the way in which it has managed its stockpile. So that is quite striking. That is a quite striking asymmetry, which is what gave the book its title.
This asymmetry that you're talking about, Dr. Tellis, as you point out all through the book when you're comparing, is both quantitative and qualitative growth in sophistication of China's arsenal. Do you think with the changing geopolitics, India has to rethink its restraint and minimum deterrence vis-a-vis China, so it doesn't have to at some point of time possibly face any nuclear bullying in terms of, say, do we need thermonuclear weapons, for example?
So the question of whether India considers its current capabilities to be sufficient, I think, will be determined by two broad factors. First is what is the future state of China-India relations? So far, India's relatively limited capabilities, I think its policymakers have judged to be sufficient for deterring both China and Pakistan. But that was in the context of India's conventional advantages against both countries, and because it has judged that China was, at least until now, an existential threat to India. And although Pakistan can be a quite formidable force, I think Indian policymakers made the judgment that Pakistan's capabilities can be countered quite sufficiently with the capabilities that India has. So the two variables that will affect India's decisions with respect to changes in its nuclear posture, I think, will be the future state of China-India relations. And I think if those relations become more and more troubled and the competition becomes more and more intense, then India may want to revisit its capabilities and make a series of adjustments. And we can talk about those adjustments in a minute. But the second factor, I think, will be also India's own role and place that it sees for itself in the world, especially in a global nuclear order that is going to get more complex over time. India has a vision of becoming a great power. It is a justified vision given India's, potentialities. And since nuclear weapons, I don't believe, are going to disappear from the planet anytime soon, the question for India will be whether, as it ascends to a great power role in the international system, whether it would not want to have nuclear capabilities of the kind that are possessed by other great powers. Again, these are issues that Indian policymakers will have to debate and think about.
Sure.
Let me quickly just address the point you raised about both quantitative and qualitative transformations. My sense is the quantitative transformations will hinge fundamentally on whether Indian policymakers believe that their current capabilities are survivable. As long as they are survivable, there may not be need for any fundamental changes. On qualitative transformations, I think the answer is more complex. Uh, Whether India will decide that it needs to really test, new weapons like thermonuclear devices, and then build a larger number of thermonuclear devices and make thermonuclear weapons the staple of its arsenal, I think will depend very much on both the global nuclear environment and the relationship that India has in the future, particularly with China. And those are both open questions at this point. So we just have to wait and watch to see what happens.
Sure. You go on to point out that US and India have common cause in constraining China. Here you talk about AUKUS, and you kind of conclude that the US, in the words of your report, should endorse and midwife what you call INFRUS, an Indo-French arrangement to help India get naval nuclear propulsion technology to build up its own sea-based deterrent, or further it, if not build it up?
So one of the things that I was sort of surprised to find as I was doing the research for this report is how the imperative of building a robust sea-based capability has only increased. I was operating on the assumption somewhat casually that the current Indian posture could remain, as it is for quite some time to come. But as I began to look at the evolving Chinese capability, the questions about the survivability of India's land-based capabilities became more and more a question in my mind. And the survivability of the land-based capabilities, which is primarily India's storage sites for its nuclear arsenal, its missile sites, its air bases, and so on and so forth, that question of survivability became prominent in my mind because I was seeing transformations in the Chinese arsenal that were not in place 20 years earlier. And the principal transformations that began to concern me were the fact that China has built up quite substantially its theater capabilities, its theater missile capabilities in particular. And those missile capabilities are marked by two characteristics, which again was not previously true. First is missiles with a high degree of accuracy, accurate enough to be able to target another state's nuclear weapons. And two, possibly reducing head yields, which, at least in theory, makes those weapons more usable in comparison to China's strategic systems, which are megaton-sized warheads and more appropriate for targeting cities and large area targets rather than weapons. So the fact that China's theater systems are now increasing in number, increasing in accuracy, and possibly will be mated to more usable nuclear weapons of smaller yield, led me to the conclusion that at some point, India will have to think seriously about the survivability of its current capabilities. Because India relies extensively on opacity. It relies on the adversary not knowing where India's capabilities are. And the argument I make in the book is that over a period of time, there is a risk that this opacity will erode. Because as surveillance technologies improve, as China begins to think of India as a very serious nuclear threat, it will begin to look for evidence about India's locations, India's strategic sites, and so on and so forth. And that only makes the imperative of a sea-based deterrent, which is also a way of protecting opacity, but by different means, by going underwater. It would make the importance of that sea-based deterrent even more. And in that context, I make the argument that because the US and India have a common interest in balancing China, and because the US has a strategic interest in making certain that India's nuclear capabilities are both safe and survivable, the US should consider what to do in case India goes back to nuclear testing at some point in the future, and what the US should do in the interim with respect to helping India build a better sea-based deterrent. So that was the rationale for leading up to the conclusions that you just flagged.
INFRUS, when you're talking about it, I don't think we know for a fact that there isn't discussion privately between the governments already. I don't know. But if that goes through in any manner that you're suggesting, what happens to the NPT? Won't it collapse with such a deal? I mean, the review conference is currently on. If two weapon states, nuclear weapon states, publicly say that they're going to help a non-NPT country, isn't that, in the words of someone I was talking to the other day, a poison chalice?
Not really, because the NPT prohibits states from transferring nuclear technologies, nuclear weapons technologies. The NPT does not prohibit states from transferring technology related to nuclear propulsion for submarines. This has been an area that the NPT is completely silent about. The United States and the United Kingdom have currently proposed to transfer nuclear submarine technologies, the propulsion technology, not the weapons, to Australia. And in the past, the United States has had, there have been reasons for why the United States have gotten to this point. So I'm suggesting that the US and France help India build a nuclear submarine, but obviously that does not extend to assisting India with respect to nuclear weapons, which is really what the NPT prohibits. So I don't really see an NPT issue with respect to assistance to India on nuclear submarine propulsion.
Sure. We're seeing those pictures from the opening, I think on the 1st of August. They're just not really related, but related to NPT. A question from a viewer, Kurt Cobain. In light of your report, Dr. Tellis, what seems to be the future NPT and of nuclear disarmament? What are the possibilities of inadvertent escalation and nuclear war or nuclear weapons in the hands of terror groups?
Well, the future of the NPT and nuclear disarmament is a very big and very open question. My own judgment is that we are unlikely to see nuclear disarmament anytime soon because the strategic environment is simply not conducive to nuclear disarmament as a solution. And as global politics continues to remain competitive, and there are new competitions arising between the United States and China, even as the old competitions between the United States and Russia persist. There are new nuclear actors like North Korea emerging, as serious nuclear powers. There are other states with nuclear ambitions like Iran, which are on the horizon. I don't see disarmament as being a realistic possibility anytime soon. So the best that the NPT will do is to try and maintain the number of nuclear capable states to the smallest possible number for as long as possible. And that is really how the success of the NPT ought to be judged. And so I think the process of the NPT, the review conferences, those will persist. There will be efforts, certainly on the part of the United States, made to stabilize the numbers of weapons in the strategic arsenals. But remember, those efforts bind today only the United States and Russia. China is not party to those conversations, nor are the other nuclear weapon states. I think that will remain the equilibrium for quite some time to come.
Just again on INFRUS, if I can take it a little bit deeper, India-France defense momentum has been building for decades. Like you said, we're talking about nuclear propulsion, not nuclear weapons, even for submarines. But why don't you suggest, say, a bilateral arrangement between India and France? Or if I want to stretch it even further, why can't or doesn't the US provide that kind of a nuclear reactor and other technology? Why do you want the US to, piggyback on the French and take all the credit?
So I think the US has been reluctant to transfer naval nuclear propulsion to any country. And that has been the case for a very, very long time. And in part, it's partly bureaucratic politics, but it's partly because the US simply, as a matter of policy, wants to maintain its undersea warfare advantages. And therefore, I think urging the United States to transfer its own nuclear propulsion technologies would be a bridge too far. I just don't see how one could get support for that idea inside the US government. France is a different matter because I think France, in principle, has been open to the idea of aiding India build a nuclear attack submarine. What I am suggesting is an extension of that idea. And I'm urging that India, France, and the United States consider extending that idea beyond nuclear attack submarines to ballistic missile submarines. And I think US support for that idea would be critical to get France to table such an offer. I do not think the French would be comfortable offering nuclear propulsion for ballistic missile submarines if that idea did not enjoy US support. And so I see US support for the idea as being an important catalyzing factor to make such an agreement possible.
Fair enough. Jovian Jolly says if China's stance regarding the LAC is any indication, its geopolitical relationship with India will continue to be adversarial. In that context, Dr. Tellis, you touch upon it in your book to a considerable extent, the invasion of Ukraine, which is shown that the rest of the world is reluctant to confront a nuclear power for fear of escalation. What if China does something similar as its limitless partner, Russia, in Taiwan or India?
I think this is something that we need to pay closer attention to and to see what lessons China draws from the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. My colleague at Carnegie, Tong Zhao, makes the argument that the Chinese have viewed Russian nuclear signaling as being very effective, that it has actually provided Russia with deterrence cover that has allowed it to prosecute its conventional aggression without fear of major power intervention in this conflict. Now, if that is the lesson that China is drawing, then that is a very unsettling lesson, because it suggests that in the future, China too could accompany any future attempts at conventional aggression under the shadow of its own nuclear signaling. And obviously, if China were to go in that direction, first, it would be a dramatic change from past Chinese practices. And two, I think it would leave countries like India in a rather disadvantaged position because India has been very scrupulous about not using its own nuclear capabilities, either for coercion or for signaling or for any objectives other than simply deterrence.
Sure. Geopolitics and geoeconomics with respect to Russia, Dr. Tellis, and even before the acceptance, which has now gained momentum, that there is a need for India to wean itself away or diversify itself away from Russia, especially in terms of weapons systems. For decades, Russia has been the only country, Soviet Union before that has been willing and able to help us develop nuclear-powered submarine capability that you're referring to, which would be crucial, say, against China. There's the debate over S-400s and CATSA as well. In that sense, is your report, can it be looked at as an attempt to, how should I put it, to knock Russia out from discussions in the strategic community in terms of its relationship with India?
No, not at all. I am personally of the view that India is not going to wean itself away from the relationship with Russia, depending on what you mean by wean, of course, right? India will maintain a relationship with Russia because Russia is important to India's view of the world in terms of multipolarity. So India sees Russia as an important power center that must not be eliminated as a power center in the global system. Because that global system is what India considers to be really desirable. So India will make its judgments about weapons acquisitions based on its interests, based on the availability of desirable systems, and so on and so forth. But I don't think India is looking to eliminate Russia as a source of either weapons or political support. And my suggestion about working with the French and the United States on this question is not driven by the objective of eliminating Russia as a source of arms. My calculation is driven by the fact that the Russian submarine program has not delivered for India in a way that is necessary for India. Russian submarines have had a history of unfortunate accidents. And even though the Russian submarine fleet is actually quite formidable in different ways, in terms of their safety and reliability, Russian submarines have been affected by many more problems than their Western counterparts. And so it is the issues relating to safety and reliability of the platform and the robustness of the technology that has led me to the conclusion that France is a much better partner for India, with or without US support, than Russia would be as far as submarine technology is concerned.
You talked about it earlier in this conversation, Dr. Tellis, India needing to test. You write about it in the report as well. You mentioned two scenarios, either if other powers go in for testing, which would possibly allow India to do it if it needs to, or circumstances demanding that India does hot tests. Now, CATSA is nothing in comparison. If that happens, the India-US nuclear deal will get thrown out, right?
No. CATSA has no impact on our civil nuclear cooperation at all.
Yeah, correct.
But the impacts would be political, right? It would suggest that India has become once again a target of coercive US legislation. And that is certainly not the intention in the executive branch. I also think it was never the intention in the legislative branch. And therefore, we've seen in recent months various efforts in the Congress to try and immunize India from the effects of CATSA legislation. And so I expect that sometime in the future, the administration will either provide a waiver for the S-400 purchase, and the Congress itself may in time enact legislation that gives India permanent immunity from CATSA, because making India a target of CATSA is really not in US national interest.
Sure. Another argument that we've seen what happened post the nuclear deal. It's in terms of nuclear energy, peaceful nuclear energy. India was given exemptions, whether it's reactors, fuel. India went through the proper channels or the procedures. Now the Chinese, did their usual shortcuts. They don't need to follow procedures. They gave reactors and fuel to Pakistan. If INFRUS happens, what will that mean in terms of China's behavior with Pakistan?
I think if Pakistan wants to develop a nuclear submarine, it will do so with assistance from any country that it can get assistance from. And it may well be that China will assist Pakistan, irrespective of what India does. We do know that Pakistan has a ballistic missile submarine research program. General Khalid Kidwai spoke about that in his interview. I think it was with Peter Lavoie at the Carnegie Nuclear Conference a few years ago. So we do know that there is a Pakistani effort to develop this capability underway anyway. Whether there is, Chinese contribution, I do not know. But I would not rule out the possibility of Chinese assistance to the Pakistani program, even today. So I'm not sure that should matter one way or the other where India's decisions are concerned.
It just shows the current geopolitical scenario that we are talking about Pakistan almost 20 minutes into this discussion, which would not have probably happened 10 years back. But you write a great deal about Pakistan's diversification of its nuclear arsenal. If you could elaborate a little bit on that for us.
So when you look at the Pakistani capabilities in 1998, they were relatively simple capabilities. They focused basically on air-delivered weapons delivered by F-16s primarily, and weapons delivered by two classes of missiles. The M11, which was a short-range ballistic missile, and the Nodong, which was rechristened the Gauri, which is a medium-range ballistic missile. And that was the extent of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal in 1998. Pakistan since then has begun to invest much more deeply in nuclear weapons than one would have anticipated at that point in time. So you have now a very diversified arsenal of land-based weapons, different kinds of missiles, sporting different kinds of warheads, different kinds of yields. You have an air-delivered capability, which consists of both gravity bombs as well as standoff weapons like cruise missiles and so on and so forth. And you have now a sea-based capability, which consists of both cruise missiles on board ships and submarines, as well as cruise missiles carried by aircraft, and possibly land-based anti-ship ballistic missiles, which are sort of weapons that mimic what the Chinese have deployed on their own seaboard against the United States. So you see a remarkable degree of diversification within each leg of the Pakistani nuclear force. And they have gone in that direction because Pakistan has doubled down on nuclear weapons as its deterrent. I think in 1998, there was the sense that we have nuclear weapons. These nuclear weapons are good enough for deterring India, and we don't need to overinvest in them. I think after 98, the thinking has changed. Pakistan has made enormous efforts in reinvesting in nuclear weapons because it sees that as being the most durable instruments for ensuring its survival. And I find that striking because at the end of the day, Pakistan's grand strategy has not changed, which is despite having nuclear weapons, Pakistan will still rely on the international community to come to its assistance in case of a serious crisis or a war with India. So, although nuclear weapons were meant to free Pakistan from the perils of dependence on an external environment, my book makes the argument that it has not been able to deliver on that count, that Pakistan's nuclear weapons will be more effective at the end of the day, not simply as instruments of deterrence and defense, but rather as catalytic instruments to bring in the international community to restrain a superior power such as India.
So, in that sense, when you're talking about Pakistan's using its nuclear weapons as deterrence, is that for major conventional warfare? I mean, we've seen strikes that have happened post terrorist attacks in India, and the Indian establishment and many analysts here would portray it as calling Pakistan's nuclear bluff.
So Pakistan's nuclear strategy actually is complex in the sense that it services multiple objectives. At the most obvious level, Pakistan's nuclear weapons are meant to deter Indian nuclear attacks on Pakistan. I think that is the least important task because I do not imagine any scenario where India would want to launch nuclear attacks on Pakistan without having suffered a nuclear attack itself, right? So I do not imagine Indian nuclear first use against Pakistan as being really a realistic possibility. But one can understand Pakistani fears, and one can understand the calculation that we need these weapons to prevent India from using nuclear weapons on us. But Pakistan has other objectives. Pakistan sees its nuclear weapons also as being critical for preventing Indian conventional attacks. So Pakistan sees its nuclear arsenal as an antidote to Indian conventional operations of significant magnitude. Now, obviously, nuclear weapons cannot prevent pinprick strikes, as we saw at Balakot. But the Pakistani calculation is that it would prevent, for example, India from unleashing cold start. But then there's a third objective as well. And the third objective, which I argue in the book, and actually I've been arguing since the late 1990s, is that Pakistan sees its nuclear weapons as providing it with the freedom to continue to needle India through low-intensity conflict, that it deters Indian conventional military operations and to that degree enlarges the strategic space for Pakistan to support terrorist groups and insurgencies within India. And so in that sense, Pakistani nuclear weapons do not simply provide it with deterrence, it also provides it with a license to conduct these operations against India. And fourth and finally, Pakistan's nuclear weapons are catalytic instruments. They guarantee that the threat of their use will bring the international community in the context of a serious crisis. And Pakistan hopes that the threat of its use of nuclear weapons would force the international community to then lean on India to prevent India from continuing, the conventional operations that are provoking these Pakistani threats. So when you look at Pakistan's nuclear strategy, it's actually a complex strategy with different elements. And it's not a simple strategy of deterrence in a way that marks, for example, India's approach to nuclear weapons.
Some quick responses, if you can give some of our viewers. Dr. Tellis, Ma Tara asks, Dr. Tellis, what are the odds of China ever using nuclear weapons against India? I can understand Pakistan using them on India, but why should China?
I agree. I think Pakistan, the odds of China using nuclear weapons against India are extremely small. And I make the argument in the book that as long as the issues of contestation pertain solely to the disputes on the border, as long as those are the only issues in play, there is literally no incentive for China to consider using nuclear weapons. But the problem is that as the aperture gets widened and you begin to think of China-India rivalries going beyond simply the border disputation, once it becomes, a geopolitical contest for status, for influence, for positional, ordering in Asia, then of course the calculus changes somewhat. And it's only in that context that one needs to worry about, the possibilities of Chinese nuclear threats. But on a day-to-day basis, as long as China does not pose existential threats to India, and as long as the rivalries, or at least the worst part of the rivalry, is simply about the border dispute, I think the incentives for China to use nuclear weapons are, extremely small, virtually zero.
Mr. X asks you, Dr. Tellis, what's the US strategy to get India into the NSG against the PRC's opposition?
So the US has been trying now for over a decade to mobilize the international community and particularly NSG members to support India's membership in the grouping. Unfortunately, the United States has not been able to overcome China's opposition to India's NSG membership. And what worked in 2008, unfortunately, is not going to work today. In 2008, the Chinese still saw themselves as a relatively weak power. And they were overly concerned about not alienating the United States. And therefore, they gave in to US pressures when the time came for the NSG to vote on that exemption as part of the US-India civil nuclear deal. Today, China sees itself as a great power, which is America's equal. And they believe, and I think with a certain degree of justification, that they can stand up to US pressure. And so my view is that China will not relent in its opposition to India's NSG membership. And the United States has no real bargaining chips at this juncture to force the Chinese to change their minds. And so I think the standoff about India's NSG membership will really persist into the indefinite future. However, I want to make one other point, though. It's important to recognize that while India's NSG membership would be a wonderful, completion of the commitments that were made by both sides during the civil nuclear agreement, the absence of membership does not impede India in any way, with the exception of rulemaking. Okay, so India cannot be a participant in NSG rulemaking. That is the one area where India is obviously denied benefits. But with respect to international nuclear commerce, India is not denied any of those opportunities. And so in that sense, NSG membership would be nice to have, but the absence of NSG membership does not pose an impediment to India's nuclear cooperation with any of the countries and the other countries in the international system. And that, I think, in many ways is, President George Bush's greatest bequest in the civil nuclear agreement to India.
You talk about INFRUS a lot in your book. Sri Krishnan Suresh asked, sometime in the future, do you see India, France, and Israel coming together to form a group of nations pitching for strategic autonomy?
Not particularly, because the three countries you identify here have very different relationships with the United States. Israel is a de facto US ally. France is part of NATO, which is an alliance institution of which is led by the United States. And India is a strategic partner. And I think the United States has lived comfortably with the varying degrees of desire for strategic autonomy on part of each of the three states. And that has not affected our relationships with them. In fact, our relationships with each of the three states is actually very close and only getting closer. So I don't see the need for the three countries to band together in any way, to protect their strategic autonomy. They can do so simply on their own strengths without the need for that kind of a partnership.
And one last question, Dr. Tellis, in terms of another Quad member, Japan, the debate about nuclear weapons in that country, though, of course, the Prime Minister was there at the NPT review conference, and he's from Hiroshima, so we know what his stance would be. But how do you see that panning out? And just to substantiate that, Mr. X saying, what's your stance on South Korea's submarine-based conventional ballistic missile tests, and Japan also talking about going nuclear?
So much of this is going to depend on what the environment in the Indo-Pacific is over the next decade or so. The question about Taiwan and how China manages the issues pertaining to Taiwan, I think, will be critical with respect to Japan's future posture. The Japanese are deeply ambivalent about nuclear weapons. There is a large portion of Japanese society that is absolutely opposed to nuclear weapons because they were victims of nuclear attack. But there are other Japanese who are becoming very conscious of the fact that China is a major and growing threat to Japan. They are worried about the United States and where the United States goes with respect to its own nuclear doctrine, its own nuclear commitments, its own nuclear posture. And so while the Japanese formally are still opposed to nuclear weapons, there is clearly a rethinking in Japan, a willingness to think about what role nuclear weapons might have in Japan's future security. So I think this issue will be determined partly by Chinese behavior, especially Chinese behavior towards Taiwan and Japan. It will be determined partly by the strength of US commitments and the resilience of US commitments to Japan. And third, it will be determined by the evolution in US nuclear doctrine. And one of the things that the Japanese are very concerned about is any pressures in the United States to declare that the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attacks. They're very concerned about that because they do want US nuclear weapons to serve as a deterrent, even against conventional attacks that may be mounted by China. So if in the nuclear posture review of years to come, the US shifts its own doctrine in the direction of saying that the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attacks, I think it would make a lot of American allies, especially the Japanese, particularly nervous. So I do see a slow shift in Japan's willingness to think about nuclear weapons in a very different way from it did in the immediate aftermath of Second World War. South Korea is a more complex question. The South Koreans recognize that their biggest threat is still North Korea. They are uncomfortable about the Chinese, but they don't see China as a military threat. And for the moment, what South Korea wants is to ensure that the United States continues to remain fully committed to South Korea's defense. That South Korea exercises, its sovereign responsibilities, acquires parity in decision making, and acquires the capabilities over time to mount an independent defense. So I expect that there will be a slow evolution in the South Korean conventional military posture, but nothing dramatic on the horizon as far as I can see.
Ashley, Tellis, thank you so much for a comprehensive chat on a lot of things that were up there. And in fact, one of our viewers also says, Vinay Singh says, thank you for sharing deep thoughts on strategic thinking of countries articulated by Dr. Tellis. She's just forgotten the name there, but that's what she means. So thank you again for your time and coming on StratNews Global, Dr. Tellis.
Of course, it's a pleasure, Amitabh. Take care of yourself.
Same to you, sir. We'll see you in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
And to all our viewers as well, thank you for joining us. I can see a lot of engagement even among our viewers in the chat box. You've seen the Telegram channel, the scroll at the bottom of the screen. If you want to join that, you will get updates on what we put up both on our website and our YouTube channel. You see the UPI QR code there. If you want to support us, you can also use YouTube's Super Thanks. Thanks for everybody tuning in on this Friday evening. You've been watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.